It started as just another day in the courtroom, but no one knew that by the time it ended, a judge, one who had ruled over cases with arrogance and impunity, would leave in handcuffs. And the person behind his downfall? None other than Pam Bondi. The tension was thick in the air as people shuffled into the grand courtroom, an imposing space with marble floors and towering bookshelves filled with legal volumes. At the center of it all sat Judge Whitaker, a man known for his sharp tongue, iron grip on his courtroom, and, as some whispered behind closed doors, a troubling record of questionable rulings. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, walked into the room with the confidence of someone who had seen it all. She had built her career on standing up against corruption, fighting for the people, and exposing those who thought they were untouchable. But even she knew that what was about to unfold would be unlike anything she had ever encountered. She was representing a man named Thomas Reynolds, a small business owner whose life had been turned upside down by a court decision that had cost him everything. His business, his home, and his reputation had all been ruined by a ruling from Judge Whitaker, one that Bondi had found deeply suspicious. And today, she was here to get justice, not just for Reynolds, but for everyone who had fallen victim to corruption hiding behind a robe. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Whitaker entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him as he took his seat at the bench. Pam Bondi remained composed, but inside, she was ready for battle. As the case began, she wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Your Honor," she began, standing tall at the podium, "we are here today because my client, Mr. Reynolds, has been the victim of an unlawful and unethical ruling, and I intend to prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt." Whitaker barely looked up from the stack of papers on his desk. "Ms. Bondi, I'd advise you to tread carefully. You're in my courtroom." A small smirk flickered across Bondi's face. "And yet, Your Honor, even you are subject to the law." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Whitaker's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Bondi continued. She laid out the details of the case, piece by piece, presenting evidence that Whitaker's ruling against Reynolds had been based on manipulated documents and testimonies. But then she took it a step further. "Your Honor, I submit into evidence financial records that show direct payments from the opposing party's legal team to an account linked to your personal finances." The courtroom went silent. Whitaker's face darkened. "That is outrageous," he snapped. "You're making baseless accusations." Bondi didn't flinch. "I have the receipts, bank transfers, emails, statements." She turned to the jury. "Judge Whitaker didn't just rule against my client, he sold justice to the highest bidder." Gasps filled the room. People whispered in disbelief. Whitaker's hands clenched into fists. "I will not tolerate this attack in my courtroom," he said, his voice shaking with barely concealed rage. "Oh, I'm not attacking," Bondi said coolly. "I'm exposing." She turned back to the court, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "This isn't just about Mr. Reynolds. I have multiple cases, multiple rulings, where evidence suggests Judge Whitaker received payments in exchange for decisions." The courtroom erupted in noise. Journalists scrambled to take notes. Attorneys exchanged glances. The weight of the accusation was undeniable. The judge pounded his gavel, trying to regain control. "Enough!" he bellowed. "This court is adjourned." Before he could finish, the doors burst open. Federal agents streamed into the room, their badges gleaming under the bright lights. "Judge Whitaker," the lead agent said, stepping forward, "you are under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The judge's face drained of color. "This is absurd," he shouted. "I demand—" One of the agents pulled out a document. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest, signed and authorized." The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the agents moved in. Whitaker tried to rise, but before he could do anything, one of the agents pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The clink of metal echoed through the room. Pam Bondi stood motionless, her eyes locked on Whitaker's as he was restrained. For years, this man had used his position to ruin lives, to manipulate justice, and to enrich himself at the expense of the innocent. And now, the law had finally caught up with him. As Whitaker was led out of the courtroom, reporters rushed toward Bondi, firing questions at her. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she simply said, "No one is above the law." The words rang out like a final verdict. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. The once powerful judge had been exposed, brought down by the very justice he had sworn to uphold. People who had once been too afraid to speak out against him now came forward, revealing years of abuse, corruption, and deceit. And through it all, Pam Bondi remained steadfast. Because for her, this was never about revenge. It was about justice, about proving that the law wasn't just a tool for the powerful, but a shield for the people. That day, the justice system had done what it was meant to do, and the courtroom, once ruled by a corrupt judge, had become a place where truth finally prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the scene was pure chaos. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved into the faces of attorneys, witnesses, and anyone who might have an opinion on what had just transpired inside. The fall of Judge Raymond Whitaker was unlike anything they had seen before, a sitting judge arrested in the middle of his own courtroom, right in front of everyone. Pam Bondi emerged from the courthouse steps with Thomas Reynolds at her side. His expression was a mix of relief and disbelief. For months, he had fought a losing battle, watching everything he had worked for be stripped away by a system he thought was rigged beyond repair. And then Bondi had come along. A reporter managed to push through the crowd. "Ms. Bondi, Ms. Bondi, did you expect the judge to be arrested today?" Bondi didn't hesitate. Justice is never predictable, but it is inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. The system worked today. More questions were hurled at her. "Do you think there are more corrupt judges like Whitaker? How deep does this go? Will you be leading an investigation into other cases?" Bondi raised a hand, calling for silence. When the crowd settled, she spoke firmly. "What happened today should serve as a reminder to everyone in power. The law is not a weapon for personal gain. Those who abuse it will be held accountable." Reynolds finally found his voice. "For the longest time, I thought people like Whitaker were untouchable," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But today, I saw firsthand that there are still people willing to fight for justice." He turned to Bondi. "Thank you." She simply nodded. "This wasn't just about you, Thomas. It was about everyone who's been wronged by corruption." Meanwhile, across town, news stations scrambled to cover the developing scandal. Analysts dissected the arrest, legal experts weighed in, and former defendants of Whitaker's cases came forward, some in tears, some in anger. Calls flooded law offices and judicial review boards, demanding further investigation. Inside a high-rise office, a group of men sat in tense silence around a conference table. They weren't politicians, but they were powerful in their own way. Wealthy attorneys, business owners, and other legal figures who had benefited from Whitaker's rulings. "This is bad," one of them muttered. "If they dig into Whitaker's cases, who knows what else they'll find?" "They'll find everything," another said, his face pale. "And Bondi isn't the type to back down." One man, older than the rest, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "We have two choices," he said. "We can wait and see how bad this gets, or we can get ahead of it." The others exchanged nervous glances. The storm was coming, and they all knew Pam Bondi was just getting started. Back at the courthouse, Bondi and Reynolds walked to a waiting car, but before she got in, a woman ran up to her. She was in her 50s, dressed modestly, her hands clutching a worn envelope. "Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice trembling. "My name is Ellen Carter. My husband was convicted in Judge Whitaker's court 3 years ago. He was innocent. We tried to appeal, but we never stood a chance." Her eyes welled up with tears. "Please, Help us. Bondi took the envelope. Inside were court documents, old newspaper clippings, and a letter, handwritten in shaky script. She glanced at Reynolds, then back at Ellen. I'm not done fighting, Bondi said, gripping the envelope. I'll look into this. A fresh wave of emotions crossed Ellen's face. Hope, gratitude, disbelief. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bondi watched as the woman disappeared into the crowd, then looked down at the envelope in her hands. She had won today, but the fight against corruption wasn't over. If anything, this was only the beginning. With a determined expression, she got into the car. The battle for justice. The car pulled away from the courthouse, but Pam Bondi's mind was already racing. She flipped through the documents Ellen Carter had given her. The case details were hauntingly familiar. Another suspicious ruling by Judge Whitaker. Another family torn apart by what now looked like blatant judicial corruption. Thomas Reynolds, sitting in the passenger seat, noticed her expression. Another case? He asked. Bondi nodded. And I doubt it'll be the last. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. How deep do you think this goes? Bondi stared out the window, watching the city pass by. Deeper than we think. Whitaker was arrogant. He didn't just take bribes, he built an entire network of people who benefited from his decisions. Lawyers, businessmen, maybe even other judges. Reynolds clenched his fists. So what happens next? Pam didn't hesitate. We dig, we expose, and we hold every single one of them accountable. As the car turned a corner, she pulled out her phone and made a call. James, it's Pam, she said. I need you to pull everything on Judge Whitaker's past cases. I want financial records, appeals, settlements, every single ruling he's made in the last 15 years. The voice on the other end whistled. You're not messing around. I never do. The car pulled up to her office, a modest but well-secured building where her team of legal analysts worked tirelessly. As soon as she stepped inside, her chief investigator, Mark Davidson, rushed over. You're not going to believe this, he said, holding up his laptop. Since Whitaker's arrest, over 24 people have come forward with claims that they were victims of his corruption. We're talking false convictions, suppressed evidence, wrongful asset seizures. This guy didn't just take bribes, he ruined lives. Pam's jaw tightened. We need to act fast. If Whitaker was working with others, they'll try to cover their tracks. Davidson nodded. Already ahead of you. We're tracing financial transactions from known shell companies linked to his offshore accounts. The money trail is insane. But there's more. He turned his screen toward her, displaying a string of emails. These were leaked anonymously. It's a conversation between Whitaker and a man named Leonard Beck. Pam's eyes narrowed. Beck? That name sounds familiar. Davidson's expression darkened. It should. He's one of the most powerful defense attorneys in the state. And according to these emails, he was paying Whitaker to ensure his clients got favorable rulings. Pam felt a fire ignite in her chest. So this wasn't just about bribes, this was a full-blown criminal enterprise. Davidson nodded grimly. Exactly. Pam exhaled slowly. Then we go public. I want press briefings scheduled. I want the Department of Justice looped in. We're blowing this whole thing wide open. Meanwhile, in a penthouse office across town, Leonard Beck paced back and forth, his usually calm demeanor cracked by frustration. His phone was ringing. Non-stop. Clients, associates, people who were now panicking because their safety net had just been ripped away. A man sitting across from him, a shadowy figure in a dark suit, tapped his fingers on the desk. Bondi is a problem. Beck scowled. You think I don't know that? He grabbed a whiskey glass and downed the drink in one gulp. She's not just going after Whitaker, she's going after everyone. The man leaned forward. Then perhaps it's time we deal with this differently. Beck's eyes flickered with something dark. He knew what the man was suggesting, and he wasn't entirely opposed to it. Make the call, Beck said, but make sure it doesn't lead back to me. Pam Bondi's fight escalates. Back in her office, Pam was completely unaware of the storm brewing against her. Her focus was on the files in front of her, the names, the victims. The undeniable proof that Judge Whitaker had been just one cog in a much larger machine. Her phone rang. "Pam, it's the FBI," said a voice on the other end. "We need to meet. Now." She grabbed her coat. The fight was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Pam Bondi arrived at the FBI field office within the hour. She was met by Special Agent Daniel Carter, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for corruption. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've been pulling financial records, case files, and testimony from informants," Carter said, leading Pam into a secure conference room. A massive whiteboard was covered in notes, diagrams, and pinned documents. At the center of it all, Judge Whitaker's name. But surrounding him were names that sent chills down Pam's spine. Leonard Beck, several high-profile attorneys, handful of state officials, and 3 other judges. Pam's eyes narrowed as she studied the board. So it wasn't just Whitaker. Carter folded his arms. No. He was a major player, but he wasn't acting alone. "We've uncovered evidence that suggests at least 3 more judges have been involved in similar bribery and case manipulation. Schemes. And then there's Beck." Pam cut in. "Beck was paying off Whitaker to secure favorable rulings. My team found emails linking them." Carter gave a grim nod. "It's worse than that. We traced wire transfers from offshore accounts linked to Beck's firm. He wasn't just bribing judges, he was running an entire legal racket. He got criminals off the hook, put innocent people behind bars, and made millions in the process." Pam clenched her fists. And now that Whitaker's been taken down, they'll be scrambling. Carter slid a file across the table. "We're already seeing signs of cover-ups, assets being moved, documents disappearing. We need to act fast." Pam opened the file and scanned its contents. Evidence destruction, witness tampering, a pattern of payments funneled through law firms and front companies. She looked up. "What do you need from me?" Carter exhaled. "We need to go after Beck before he vanishes. If we don't get him soon, he'll disappear, and this whole operation could fall apart." Pam's eyes hardened. "Then let's get to work." The Sting Operation. Over the next 48 hours, Pam worked with the FBI to coordinate an airtight case against Beck. Every financial record, every suspicious ruling, every shell company linked to him was put under a microscope. Meanwhile, Beck was growing desperate. He had already begun liquidating assets and making arrangements to leave the country. But what he didn't know was that his closest associate, one of his top legal advisors, had flipped. The FBI had secured a deal with him, and he was now feeding them critical information in exchange for leniency. The net was tightening. On the morning of the raid, Pam watched from a surveillance van as a team of federal agents closed in on Beck's office. Through the live camera feed, she saw him sitting at his desk, completely unaware that his empire was about to collapse. Then, bang, bang, bang. "FBI, open up." The door burst open. Agents flooded the room. Beck shot to his feet, his face draining of color. "What the?" he stammered. "Leonard Beck," an agent announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and racketeering." Pam watched as Beck was handcuffed, his world crumbling in real time. She leaned back in her seat and let out a slow breath. One more corrupt figure taken down, but she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The fallout. In the weeks that followed, the scandal rocked the legal world. News outlets covered it endlessly. Former clients of Beck's firm came forward with horror stories. More judges were placed under investigation. Pam Bondi's name was on every headline, praised by some, feared by others. But she didn't care about the attention. She cared about the people who had been wronged. One evening, as she packed up her office, her phone buzzed. It was Ellen Carter. "Ms. Bondi," Ellen's voice cracked. "I just wanted to say, they're reopening my husband's case, because of you." Pam smiled softly. "That's what justice looks like, Ellen." As she hung up, she glanced at the stacks of files still on her desk. There was still work to be done, and Pam Bondi wasn't